who are doing that are really not trying to say anything about law. On the contrary, I think if you argue that Kosovo is unique, you are basically saying that there is no law of secession and no law of independence, and this is an extraordinary case which is outside of legal regulation. And I think that's the point they want to make. It's not that it's legal, but rather that it's so extraordinary that it's beyond the legal regulation. But in terms of legal precedent, you cannot find a legal precedent, a legal judgment or a legal principle which would justify only Kosovo and no other secession. I mean, that's simply not possible. And as I mentioned, there are precedents to Kosovo, and one of the clearest precedents is secession of Bangladesh from Pakistan in 1971, which was not opposed by the United States at the time, which was the United States was engaged in the Vietnam War at the time, but that was a secession which was enabled by incursion, invasion of the Indian army and defeat of the Pakistani army by the Indian army. So it was, in a sense, similar to the whole process in case of Kosovo. Mm-hmm. And also we find that after the recognition came very quickly from the ally, first from India and then from the allies of India, and then UK also came in and Australia. So this was a clear-cut case of a secession which was preceded by a military invasion, intervention by another state, and we have the very similar case in case of Kosovo.
Going back to the inconsistency of this Kosovo uniqueness argument, I think it's underscored by the fact of how promptly the tables have turned since 2008. I mean, back then it was Western powers who used humanitarian reasons, the right of self-determination and the suffering of refugees as reasons for supporting the independence of Kosovo, while Serbia and Russia, as you know, stood on territorial integrity and sovereignty. But this time around, in the case of Crimea, we see a complete reversal of these positions. I wonder, from your point of view, how different these two cases are.
Well, the major difference to us who study secession is the absence of violence. And this is an extraordinary case in Crimea, is that we do have a sort of, let's say, hidden military intervention of an outside power, which doesn't consider itself to be an outside power because it had its own military on the territory. So we have that, but we have no resistance, no violence, no attempt to use violence, or very little violence just after the proclamation of independence. So if you look at the history of secessions, this would be highly unusual, and it shows that both sides, that Ukraine and Russia, have in fact a tacit agreement that violence won't solve anything there. Resistance to this would not have prevented secession, would not have really done anything but just led to deaths of people. So in a sense we have this, I think, quite a rational calculation.
I wonder, Professor Pavkovic, if Russia could really advance this case of Crimea being a special case, and not only because there's very little violence on the ground, but also, you know, there are historical ties that go back for centuries. There were some legal irregularities in a way. Nikita Khrushchev handed Crimea over to Ukraine, and you know, back then he had no reasons to believe that it would ever be beyond Moscow's control. I wonder if that could be used as a legal rationale to justify Russia's actions in Crimea.
You could use it as a political justification. It has been used. There is no legal standing for this kind of argument, because if you try doing that, then Mexico could claim Texas anytime. Texas was taken away illegally from Mexico. So, and there are some people in Mexico.
Well, I think you may be encouraging yet another secessionist movement here.
I hope not. Some people accuse me of doing that, but I'm really not suggesting anything. I'm simply saying, look, if you start using these arguments, then you'll find all over the world, including the United States, a number of irregularities of this kind. So I don't think there's a legal
And I
argument.
think this is exactly what experts were saying back in 2008 when this Western rationale for Kosovo was advanced, that that was essentially open a Pandora box, not only in Europe but all around the world. And I think this is what we are seeing happening, right?
Well, that's certainly true, but what I think when Kosovo was happening, what possibly the policymakers were thinking, that since Bangladesh was forgotten very quickly in a few years, the whole issue of legality and non-legality, the whole thing simply disappeared except in scholarly literature. They were hoping that the whole thing with the Kosovo will disappear as an issue. However, it didn't disappear. And I don't think it will disappear now, because there are other parts of Europe which would want to secede, in particular Catalonia and Scotland. So these cases, we have a growth of secessionist movements, and therefore when you have one successful one, and successful one unfortunately through the use of force, as in Kosovo, you will that will serve as an example or encouragement to other secessionist movements, whatever you say. In addition, and of course, Crimea might as well serve as an encouragement to others, because they will see, okay, if they did it, we can do it as well. It's a perfectly normal political thinking. I think there's nothing extraordinary about that.
Now, speaking about Crimea, Russia made it clear that it considers the Crimean case to be closed. President Putin just signed an executive order solidifying Crimea joining Russia. But what is not a done deal is international recognition of Crimea's new status, and Western countries have already made it clear that they are not going to recognize it anytime soon. I wonder, though, if international recognition in this case matters at all, because as part of Russia, supposedly Crimea wouldn't have to suffer some of the discrimination that other unrecognized quasi-states suffered in the past. I guess just the fact of it joining Russia will shield it from many of those negative consequences.
That's probably true, and that might have been an additional reason for secessionist politicians in Crimea to argue for such a quick incorporation into Russia, because that provided them protection which they would otherwise, as a small state, not have. And it provided, of course, recognition insofar as they are part of a functioning state. So that idea that you find yourself a powerful sponsor and become part of that as a state is not a very frequent phenomena in the secessionist world, partly because there are not many sponsors who want to take the parts of territory and incorporate into their territory, because there's too heavy cost. And of course, I think Crimea will be costly in terms of the costs of incorporation, but given that the Russian Federation can afford that kind of cost, I don't think it's a major issue in this case. But Crimea is a particularly interesting case because it provided a very quick as it were, secessionist outcome, and then incorporation in a large and powerful state. And some secessionist movements might think that this is really the way to go, except, of course, as I said, there will be very, very few sponsors.
Well, one such example would be, for example, the case of Northern Cyprus. It's been 40 years since the Turkish invasion, and Northern Cyprus is not formally part of Turkey, but de facto it is. And as far as I know, right. Turkish Cypriots have been developing, pretty rapidly, even notwithstanding the fact that no other country apart from Turkey recognized them formally.
Now, the Northern Cyprus is also interesting because there are significant segments of Turkish Cypriot population who would want to unite back with Cyprus for the benefits of EU membership. And Turkey is not probably for some time to become a member of the EU. Cyprus is already a member, so there is an attraction. And this is a new element in secessionist movement, and that is the attraction of the EU, because the EU brings infrastructural funds, it brings investment. So if you can get into a country which is a member of the EU, there are definite benefits. And you can see that in case of the two new secessionist movements, the Scottish one and Catalonian one, they are very strong on retaining the membership in the EU, because that's considered to be a great prize for any state in Europe.
Professor Pavkovic, what I find very curious is that, countries that, or states that are outside of the European Union really want to get in, but there are a number of countries, like Britain, for example, which would rather prefer to get out and free themselves from the EU. Since we have only a few minutes left, international law has traditionally approached secessionist conflicts through the effective control doctrine. So essentially it doesn't mean whether the secessionist movement was legitimate from the very beginning. What means is who is calling the shots at the end. And I wonder if this is, in this sense, any secession movement is essentially a case of might making it right.
Well, you can say so, but no secessionist movement is successful without a widespread mobilization of population. In other words, you have to get people to vote for you or to support you, and that is an exercise of political skill and political might, but it's really not an exercise of coercive power. So a secessionist movement, unlike other, if you want, international relations, are not governed by the sheer fact of coercive power. It is a question of the ability to politically mobilize the population. And that, of course, is helped if the population has grievances. So you are, as a secessionist movement, you're basically exploiting people's grievances to convince them that they need a separate state of their own. So it's not quite of the sheer might deciding. However, if you have a very powerful state which is opposing you, then the question of who has more military skills or whose sponsor have you got becomes a crucial at the end.
So essentially, Professor Pavkovic, we are back to what we started from, that when it comes to secessions, what matters is not so much the law, but rather politics. I guess we have to leave it there because we ran out of time, but I really appreciate your being on the show.
Thank you.
And to our viewers, keep the conversation going on our Twitter, YouTube, and Facebook pages, and I hope to see you again. Same place, same time, here on Worlds Apart.